Now, one of the most talked about industries on social media is the banking industry. And this week we took a look at how the public has responded to the apps provided by South African banks.
And our regular guest, JP Kloppers, who's given us some great graphs, and he's got some more tonight. He's the CEO of Brand's Eye, and he joins us now for some of that detailed social media analysis, insider research, not only on the banks, but certainly in particular on the banks. Welcome, JP.
Thank you.
I cannot remember a time anymore in my mind before banking apps. It almost seems as if this is what it's always been. It's almost hard to imagine. And I would think that the space, therefore, must be quite competitive. Just as a broad overview, JP, what is the landscape of banking apps in South Africa? Everybody has one. How does the competition look like?
They all do have one, and I think all the banks are trying to move people out of branches and into digital forms where the cost of service is much lower. So this banking app area is a hotly contested space. And what we did was look at the last couple of months and what are people saying, particularly about the app, not just generally talking about the banks, but in looking at sentiment towards the banking apps. And we saw some interesting results. Some of it is as you'd expect. But Capitec coming out.
Well, tell us what we got there.
Here we've got the volume. So you can see Nedbank quite small compared to the other.
So the volume of conversation.
This is the volume of people talking about the banking apps.
Yeah.
And FNB, as you'd expect, they do a lot of stuff online. So they come out top.
They were the first as well, I think, to have this kind, the sophisticated app, I think. Weren't they ahead of the game?
I'm not sure. I think they have been ahead of the game on many things. Whether they were the first to market with a banking app, I'm not sure.
Let's have a look at the chart again.
Interestingly here, this is now looking at ignoring volume, just looking at the sentiment.
Yeah.
So when customers talk about their banking app, whether they're talking to the bank or just about the bank to their friends, this is what comes out. And Capitec definitely getting the most, almost by a long way, the most positive sentiment. ABSA, interestingly enough, in second place. And that was a surprising result to me. And then
so FNB is also extremely interesting because almost 30% of negative conversation, and that makes you wonder, how much. I mean, they are at the forefront, but how much of the product is actually seen to be qualitative by the consumer? Yeah,
we've seen it a lot with FNB actually. This kind of negative sentiment, almost because they've got a really great marketing campaign, the switch and save, and everybody knows Steve, there we go. And but what?
So it's about delivery on the promise.
Exactly. I think that's where there's kind of a bit of a brand mismatch in experience when people actually use the app. In that does have some bugs. It's not as easy to use as ones they maybe switch from.
But in excess of 40% is actually a very, very big percentage for Nedbank or for any bank for that matter.
But it also sounds like maybe they're all getting it wrong. They're all still learning.
Yeah, I think so.
They can't all be so negative.
ABSA put out a new banking app, I think it was in March of this year. So a lot of their positive sentiment has come from that. They pulled it off well, very few bugs, they executed well. And I think for an ABSA customer, the bar was relatively low. So the step up to the banking app was a good step. For Capitec, they're just doing the basics well. Keeping people out of branches. And interestingly, you can get your bank statements in your banking app. You can do a credit check in your banking app. And so those kinds of things which ordinarily they would have gone into a branch for, they now no longer have to.
So these,
what are these two telling us?
So Dave, these are, that's a Capitec app. And
Correct.
the other one's an ABSA app.
Correct.
And just by looking at this picture, I'm getting the sense of the usability of the Capitec app is much better. What makes a good app?
I think in as few clicks as possible, doing what you want to do. And that's where I haven't used the ABSA app, but I would imagine just looking at it, the usability is certainly in a different league. What ABSA did do, which the other banks, certainly Standard Bank and Nedbank didn't do, was make the data free. And that was one of the biggest factors influencing sentiment on social media towards the banks, is the fact that once you've run out of data, you can go into the app and your banking still works.
And that's the most frustrating thing. You run out of data, you run out of airtime, and then you don't know how to actually get back on until you get to a Wi-Fi zone.
Yeah.
They've got to fix that.
They do. So FNB, Capitec, and ABSA all offer free data when you use the banking app.
So that's a big distinguisher. But what else is going to make for a good app? What's going to put someone else in the
What are
lead?
these ones here?
So these are the other three. These are just examples of their user interfaces. FNB on the left also kind of looks pretty plain, which is maybe why it's not getting as much positive sentiment. And then Nedbank and Standard Bank. Standard Bank, you would have remembered from a couple of weeks ago when we looked at them. They're also getting a lot of negative sentiment across the board, not just on the app. So I do think they've probably got some things to address in their customer experience journey.
As well as the online platform, because I think they've had the most incidences in this year at least, where the entire online banking system is just offline.
That's right, and that was true of the app as well. Kind of the negative sentiment was around their bugs, it's offline, it crashed, it's not compatible with my phone. That sort of sentiment being expressed.
So now we're seeing some of the actual tweets that have come through at Capitec.
Again, just doing the basics well. They offer, as you see, the highest interest rate on fixed deposits. Why would you want to use any other bank? And then on the app, they're saying the app is brilliant. People love it. It's easy to use. It's intuitive. They can quickly get to where they need to go. And so people love it.
And interestingly enough, just the brand sentiment around Capitec is also changing, where people are realizing it's actually cool to be a Capitec customer, as against the initial perception that if you're banking at Capitec, it means you have no money.
Yeah. Standard Bank most negative.
They are the most negative. Yeah, I think they've had some issues on their banking platform, like you mentioned. See, and that's propagated through to the app where it does crash. I think they've had a few compatibility issues as well, where it hasn't worked on every handset, and that's obviously, you need to check those things before you put an app like this out to the public domain.
So now we're going to turn to the trend of the week, and it's going to be really exciting because we're going to be looking at sentiment around political parties that's coming up, but that we have a double edition. So wait and see what the second topic we're going to be tackling is. So our trends of the week, JP, the double edition that you're presenting today.
Well, the big trend this week obviously was Oscar Pistorius. The sentencing came down.
I would have thought people would have lost interest by now, whatever, but clearly not.
No, I think that it surprised us as well, because we tracked, from 2014, and during the event when the trial started, we saw 85,000 people in South Africa commenting. This was just yesterday, 193,000 mentions just in South Africa about Oscar Pistorius.
And is that the highest number of people commenting on the issue since it began?
Ever. So it's actually become a bigger issue in people's mind.
And what are people saying? What's the big voice that's coming through?
I mean, the massive, overwhelming voice is 6 years, why so little? And we've got some tweets up where if you shoot a rhino, you get 25 years. And that kind of comparison, the guys who burgled.
And this tweet refers to these two very intelligent robbers who approached a journalist who was being filmed on SABC and robbed him and her or whatever. Of course, they were identified. But the point is being made, well, what they did was wrong, but they got 15 years and Oscar got 6.
Yeah, so I think that's been the biggest outcry. It's just that 6-year mark. Like, how can you only get 6 years?
I suppose if she'd got 14 or 12, they would have said, okay, and that number would not have been nearly so big.
Maybe. I think it's a South African court that's been struck, which is again the race course. Like, was this an issue of white privilege, and that because he had money he could get a lower sentence? I think we also need to look at it from the perspective, and I read a great article this morning in the Mail and the Guardian, just around bearing in mind he did have money and he's still been convicted. So I think that's also
by a black judge.
Yeah, but that's also good. When you look at the actual conviction rate on murders in South Africa I think it's sub 10%, depending on which stats you read. The fact that we actually had somebody with great legal counsel that got convicted.
That's a brilliant tweet.
If Riva was a rhino, Oscar would have gotten 25 years. I mean, that is something. But I think it must have also opened a conversation around the credibility of the judicial process and system in South Africa. Because if white privilege can still rear its head even within the courts, then is our judicial system as strong as we think it is? And as impartial as we think it is? What are your views on that?
Yeah, again, I kind of look at it from two angles. The one is that he clearly struck an emotional chord in the judge, in being an amputee, that he received some kind of special treatment, because you can't get 6 years.
I don't think in this case, and I'm not saying that we're immune to racial influence and unconscious and conscious, I don't think in this case he was given what he got because of race. I think this particular judge took a view on what he'd done and the mitigation versus the aggravation, which she explained. I mean, you can disagree with it.
Yeah.
She did explain it. But as you say, it touches
I
the
don't
fault
necessarily agree. I think there's a certain element of white privilege, because I think had this been a black person who had shot anyone, whether black or white, through the door, I just can't. A black person who's also not a celebrity. So there's also the privilege of status. That's also coming through. I do not think that person would have gotten 6 years, and to a large extent, it also links with the broader global conversation right now around the fact that Black Lives Matter.
The appeal court did all it could
Yeah.
to say, "Oh, this is murder. This is not culpable homicide."
Yeah, I mean, to your point, that on that Black Lives Matter, I think that there is this kind of global just escalation of racial tension which we're seeing, which we really need to try and address in some way. And I think looking at the data really helps us take a view that this is not white against black. I think everybody's feeling the same way about these things.
It's a global pulse right now that just seems to have taken our focus. But I think we're segueing quite nicely into the political conversations that have dominated social media this week. What were the key findings around those conversations?
It's early days in looking at the elections, but we've started tracking sentiment, and we're going to look at the national sentiment at the moment. But and in the weeks to come, we'll drill down into the contested municipalities.
That'll be fascinating.
Joburg, Durban, Cape Town, and Nelson Mandela Bay, just where the real battle is going to take place. But interesting in looking at just the last couple of days of what are people saying on social media towards the political parties. We're seeing quite a lot of positive sentiment being expressed towards the EFF, you can see there, which again, to me that was surprising. Towards the DA, they're getting good positive sentiment. They made I don't know if it's a misstep. There was quite a big backlash in them
about
using...
the calls?
No, actually in them using Nelson Mandela's voice in their ad.
Well.
And the ANC is saying, you can't do that, he's an ANC figure. And I think certainly for me, I don't view Nelson Mandela as an ANC figure. He's a global figure.
Well, I mean, surely the point is, of course they can do it if they want to, but it was a misjudgment in terms of...
especially with the family having to step into the fray and saying, you actually cannot do this.
Yeah.
So interesting times in South Africa, and the battle for the ownership of Nelson Mandela. It will be interesting to see, when we get to the the presidential elections in 2019, to what extent there's going to be that second fight for the ownership of Nelson Mandela. The interesting thing, though, about EFF that you've raised, a lot of positive sentiment around the EFF. Is it because they seem to be taking on the racial issues in the country as well? So what kind of conversations are they being associated with?
I think at the moment it's just that they're campaigning hard. They're saying all the right things which appeal to their voter base. The misstep they took, not so much a misstep. I think what's happening in Zim had a negative effect on the EFF this week. Because Julius Malema in the past has kind of supported the Zim model, economic model, and we've seen that play out really badly in the last week. That's had a negative effect on the EFF. What the lasting kind of impact of that over the next couple of weeks will be, we wait to see. But I think it's going to be a very close and interesting race as we see this kind of sentiment unfold over the weeks to come.
And then, of course, there's always the interesting thing of just looking at the ANC. During election time, we're not used to seeing the ANC sitting at the bottom of the rankings. And here, when we take a look at the sentiment on social media, in any case, almost 0.25% in weakness. And this, I'm assuming, JP, is a reflection of the negative sentiment associated with the ANC.
Correct, yeah. You can on the positive sentiment, their advocates aren't coming out as strongly. But the big thing that's hit them this week is the whole censorship debacle with the SABC, and then to a lesser degree, the usual kind of Zuma and corruption charges coming through.
What I heard was interesting, the SABC chairman saying, what we've done doesn't conflict with ANC policy. Yeah. So he thought, well, why is it supposed to?
Why are you benchmarking yourself against ANC
but
policy?
Then he did say, the chairman did say then, we are not the ANCs, we are the public broadcaster. But now the ANC is wanting to know why Schlaudi's doing what he is. So there's a lot going on, and you're saying a lot of that is coming through negatively.
It's coming through, yeah. And I think the benefit of social media, and we saw it in Brexit, is it gives people a voice and a community that supports that voice, which wasn't there 10 years ago. You know, that you can go out there and say things and find people who have a similar view. And I think we'll see a similar dynamic play out here.
Well, that's in-depth discussion. Fascinating, the stats that you pull out with this, and with the election coming, the municipal election is going to be even more interesting. Thanks to JP Kloppers. He is the CEO of Brands Eye.